Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon if you are in England and Europe. Good evening if you're in Japan. Maybe early morning if you're an early riser in North America. It's a great pleasure to have you all in our research webinar, Center for Japanese Studies research webinar, which has become now a tradition over the past few years here at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, in England. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Sherzad. I'm lecturer in Japanese history here in the School of History. However, this webinar is an interdisciplinary webinar, and it's a result of a collaboration of all colleagues here. So not just the School of History, but also colleagues from other schools at the University of East Anglia, which is under the umbrella of the Center for Japanese Studies, which is an organization within UEA which promotes Japanese studies and organizes different activities and events. So this is our third webinar in this semester, and we are having 4. So we have one more, and I will, at the end, I will announce the next one, which will be in May. But today we have a very interesting media and comic themed talk by Professor Brian Hikari Hartzheim, who is a professor at Waseda University. And today's talk is Komikkusu Media, the History and Affordances of Manga's Print Paperbacks. So I will see if Reina can join us and make an official introduction. But let me just briefly walk the attendees through some of the technical bits. Please, if you have a question, please use the Q&A function in this Zoom seminar, in your Zoom app. Whichever you're using, if it's a desktop app or a mobile app, and please type your question, and at the end of the talk we will be able to put these questions. I or Reina will read those questions out for everybody's sake, and then our guest speaker will answer them. And the talk itself is anywhere between 45 to 50 minutes, and we will have a chance at the end to do a 20-25 minute Q&A session. So I'm really looking forward to it, and it's going to be an interesting talk, especially for students who are studying Japanese studies with us or elsewhere. I have heard that Professor Hartzheim's students are also here, which is, I'm sure, is a great collaboration, a great occasion for us to have students from several institutions during this talk. Okay, so I think we will just start, Professor Hartzheim, if that's okay. So as I said, Professor Brian Hikari Hartzheim is a professor at Waseda University's Faculty of International Research and Education. His research areas, his main research is in humanities and social sciences, specifically aesthetics and art studies. And he has worked at Waseda University's School of International Liberal Studies in the Graduate School of Culture and Communication Studies since 2017. He held other posts at different institutions before that. And he has published widely, extensively in various journals, and some of his papers are, for example, Toriko's Database World, published in International Journal of Comic Art. He has papers in Journal of Popular Culture, Television and New Media, and many others on different subjects relating to mangaka and manga magazines and other related fields. And he's today, as I already mentioned, we'll be talking about the history and affordances of manga's print paperbacks. So without further ado, please help me welcome Professor Brian Hikari Hartzheim.
Thank you, Shirzad, for that very generous introduction. And thank you to the University of East Anglia for inviting me, the Center for Japanese Studies for inviting me. I know that it's not easy to manage something like this during these challenging times. So I really hope my talk today is worthy of the invitation. I know that UAA also has a comic studies department that Reina is chair for, is chair for. So I hope this talk is of some interest to the faculty, and I invite any feedback or questions on the topic after my talk is finished. So the impetus of this talk started actually last year when Kimetsu no Yaiba, or Demon Slayer Mugen Train, also known as, I guess, Infinite Train or Infinity Train, became the highest grossing film of all time in the Japanese box office. And this was in the midst of a coronavirus pandemic that's been raging in the world for the last year and a half. It's based on Gotouge Koyoharu's violent shonen or boys manga set in the Taisho era about a shadow brigade of swordsmen who slay flesh-eating demons. And it was an unlikely and unexpected savior of the film industry following the relaxation of self-imposed seating restrictions in the fall. The news was accompanied by the fact that several volumes of the manga on which the film is based were the top-selling publications of the year as well. And they were selling over 100 million volumes during the lifetime of the manga's serialization in the manga magazine Weekly Shonen Jump, and half of those volumes were sold in 2020 alone. The heavy sales of these paperbacks helped to keep the publishing industry afloat in a similar fashion to how the film buoyed the movie industry, not only through direct sales, but also through bringing interest and attention to other merchandise and periodicals. Manga paperback sales have become the dominant force of manga publication revenue for publishers. Manga in Japan are serialized in magazines weekly or monthly, and then after enough chapters have been published, they are collected in a paperback called a comics, which is the title of this talk. For decades, publishers pursued magazine sales as proof of the publication's success. Magazines are, again, cheaply produced. They're produced on flimsy colored newsprint. I don't have a magazine to show you here today, but just imagine really cheap newsprint. Their profitability comes for the publisher from sales volume, advertisements, and a long tail of the manga's adaptation into other media formats, what's often identified in Japan as a media mix strategy of spreading licensed content across multiple media platforms. The sales of manga magazines, again, were the indicator of a popularity of a given publication. Weekly Shonen Jump, which has been long considered the most popular and best-selling manga magazine, at one point sold a record 6.5 million issues in a single week. But now only a fraction of those numbers are moved today. I think probably Shonen Jump is still the highest circulating magazine, but it only circulates a little over a million issues a week now. And ad revenues are falling. Obviously, that's not something just for manga magazines, but all types of print publications in the face of digital advertising. So individual paperback sales have become increasingly important to balance the publisher's bottom line. I talked about Kimetsu no Yaiba, the movie. The movie did 40 billion yen, or nearly 40 billion yen. 40 billion yen. It's the highest grossing film ever in the Japan box office. But the manga also, these individual paperback volumes did 30 billion yen from print volume sales alone. That's not including digital, which also has a sizable footprint. In 2020, last year, the height of the pandemic, while print manga magazine sales declined 13% from the previous years, paperback sales increased by 24%. And that was fueled in large part by the buzz of Demon Slayer and other manga that were in its orbit. Now, of course, it should be said that this particular year was maybe an anomaly and distorted due to the global coronavirus pandemic. The same report showed that digital manga magazine sales actually increased by 15%. However, digital manga volumes, paperback volumes also increased by an even more 31%. So no matter which way you look at it, there's a huge discrepancy between magazine and paperbacks now, and total paperback sales far surpassed magazine sales in 2020. So this reflects a changing manga industry that now consistently needs to rely on paperback sales for revenues in the face of declining magazine sales, and also to provide royalties to manga authors. And so, yeah, some of this is the material here I was talking about. And yet this wasn't always the case. Comics, in fact, were largely thought to be a side business after the primary purpose of pushing monthly or weekly magazine sales. And with all the buzz about Kimetsu no Yaiba, Demon Slayer, breaking sales records, I became interested in looking at comics as a form of manga media that has become increasingly important in the face of these changing manga economics. And Komikkusu are not simply a republishing format, is what I found, but they fulfill a variety of creative functions that actually continue to serve, that have served manga historically and continue to serve manga as a platform for creative expansion of the original manga text. Nakano Haruyuki has argued that one of the unique historical facets of Japan's manga as media is that they're both hardware and software, meaning that manga for decades referred to both the content, the individual works, and the delivery system, magazines and books for the product. There is a lot of existing manga content analysis, manga software analysis, analyses of manga narratives, form, aesthetics, is quite common, is much more common, I think, than analyses of manga hardware. Manga hardware, on the other hand, revolves around platforms, around vehicles of delivery. And even within manga hardware, there's quite a bit more on manga magazines. There's much more, especially in the English language discourse, on magazines and their role in spreading and growing and propagating manga content, and how it's framed by editors and manga titles and advertisements within the magazine. And there's a gap, at least in the English language literature, on manga books. And if you look at my my wallpaper here, you'll see that actually that's the main form of how these books are consumed, globally speaking. So if you go to bookstores, you don't get to see magazines really, you see books, and books are where most people outside of Japan have increasingly looked at in terms of what they believe to be manga to be. And so these books, I think, deserve to be analyzed for their own affordances, their own functions in bringing manga and regulating manga, imagining manga. And again, this discourse is quite a bit richer in Japan than it is in the English language. So I'm going to be sharing some of this discourse today, and I hope to also share my own contributions to this discourse, specifically looking at Kimetsu no Yaiba and its more recent contributions using manga comics as a form. So part 1 and 2 here, it's actually more combined than it looks like. I'll be looking at how comics have shaped manga historically, and the affordance they bring to manga organization and creativity. By affordances, I refer to the term popularized by psychological and technical design to describe, as Donald Norman defines it, as what actions are possible within a given object. And in this talk, I'll be describing the affordances, or mapping the affordances, of manga comics that have developed through its historical role as an ancillary platform. And I say part 2, but it's really more kind of the final part of this presentation. I'll be looking at Kimetsu's value-added affordances in their comics today. So I just want to clarify some language, some key terms first, because I say comics, and this sounds like the word comics. And so I want to make sure that we're using a term here that maybe is not as familiar outside of this particular context. So first, the word manga. Manga has a lot of different debates about what it means and how to define it. Some people think it must be in Japan. Some people argue there are international manga, and manga is a style. I'm not going to wade into those debates here. I'm going to use manga as a term that's used in Japan to refer to sequential art commissioned for a special periodical. In other words, manga in this talk is referring to content. And I want to make that clear because I'll be talking about platforms, or I'll be talking about vehicles, the hardware in this talk. And I don't want to get that confused with when I say manga, when I'm referring to the software. So when I say manga in this talk, I'm really referring to manga works, the content, not the book itself. And that's really why I want to clarify also these other terms here, and what are the media, or what are the platforms that have been used to spread manga historically. So like I said before, magazines or zashi, these have been widely talked and discussed about, written about. These are serial platforms that feature many different works. Again, I don't have one on hand, but they're 300-400 pages thick, and they feature 10 or 15 different chapters, maybe 15 to 20 pages of manga by different authors. Examples include Shonen, Weekly Shonen Jump or Sunday, Shoujo Ribbon or Nakayoshi, and these manga magazines serve different demographics. Some are for young boys, for young girls, young adults, for salarymen. You have really specialized manga magazines for like pachinko players even. So again, there's a lot, I think, that's of important stuff that's written on that. And I won't be touching upon that as much today, but I'll be using this word comics, and I've spelled it out here in like 3 different ways, katakana and romanization, comics here. Comics in this talk refer to the paperback reprint associated with a publisher of selected chapters of a single manga work. That means essentially, once enough chapters in a manga magazine are serialized, they become collected into a comics. All right. And this is the word that's used by different publishers to describe these types of paperbacks. And I'm saying this to clarify that this is not comic or comic, which is the word that you might think of to describe all types of sequential art. In fact, in Japan, it's also used to describe all kinds of graphic sequential art. And it's can be confusing. So I want to just clarify, when I say comics, I'm not referring to sequential art. Even in Japan, comics often is used to describe, non-Japanese works. There are some people who say, okay, comics and manga, that's the same thing, right? It's just a different word for it. And there are some who argue that komikku is non-Japanese works like American comics, amekomi. And again, I'm clarifying here for the purposes of this particular talk, comics means these paperbacks, and manga means the manga stories and content. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get into a little bit of manga's origins here. For those of you who are familiar with manga publishing history, this might be a little redundant old hat, but I'll be looking again at manga as media in this talk. And while some scholars characterize manga as an art form, as an aesthetic that goes back to the Edo period, I'm focusing on manga as media. And as such, I really strongly would argue that they're a post-war phenomenon. And so I'm going to give this post-war origins here very briefly about where post-war manga media was established. Manga were first read in one of 3 main venues that I'm going to outline here. The first one is rental books. And these were the first rental book manga when picture card artists began producing collections of their works for publishers. And publishers would sell these books to rental shops called kashihonya. And in the post-war period, Japanese consumers were destitute, and many in and around the Kanto area wanted entertainment cheaply and quickly, and renting was much cheaper than buying. So these books that were published were actually quite sturdy. They were hardcover. Books, and they were meant to withstand many people checking them out and returning them after several days. So kind of like libraries that charged, because they were popping up all over the place, so more ubiquitous even than libraries. Another form here that we have are red books, or akahon, and these were popular west of Tokyo in the Kansai Osaka region. And these books were sold cheaply on the streets, and they got their name from a red ink that was used to illustrate all the different illustrations inside the book. And so you can see a couple examples here in the top right. So in the top left here, or in the left-hand side, you can see a kashihonya. And you can see on the right-hand side here a couple of pictures of red books. This characteristic red ink is what distinguished the red books. And you can also see on the bottom right here, magazines. And these were the third platform here that also emerged around the same time to facilitate this mindset of pumping out stories quickly and consuming them cheaply. And many famous manga authors, from Tezuka Osamu, who you can see in the middle here with the Shin Takarajima, New Treasure Island, the revolutionary pioneering book. That was an akahon that came out. You can see on the bottom left here, this is Mizuki Shigeru's work with Gegege no Kitaro. Here it's called Hakaba Kitaro. So this was a kashihon or rental book. And so many famous mangaka, Tezuka, Mizuki, Shirato Sanpei, got their start in one of these arenas producing cheap entertainment for the masses. Rental books, red books, and magazines were also highly disreputable forms that were impermanent, not about ownership, and also for children's consumption. Beginning with Kappa Books in 1954, publishers began to publish manga content in books, or shoseki. And these were called Shinshoban comics and targeted towards older consumers. As Yamamori Hiroshi has described it in his book, Komikkusu no Mediashi, a media history of comics, we can see this adult targeting through several aspects. First is the format. Manga magazines are big. I really do wish I had a magazine here to show you. They're big and they feature large illustrations, and shrinking them down into a small book form, a paperback, made little sense in the minds of magazine publishers in terms of it's diluting the product, right? The pleasure is in reading these big illustrations on a large magazine that you can fold out. However, by shrinking them down to a small paperback, they could also be sold in bookstores alongside literary works, and read by adult commuters on trains without shame. And you might laugh, but actually this is a tradition that continues to this day. If you go to buy a book in a bookstore in Japan, a new book, you'll be asked if you want a cover. And the cover is designed to give you privacy because the expectation is you'll be reading it on some kind of public transportation like a bus or a train. So by shrinking manga, shrinking these big magazine and manga to a small book size, by putting a cover on it, you could read it in public and no one would know that you are, engaging in this shameful activity of reading manga in public. I should add, I don't think that's as big of a deal now. Manga has become so ubiquitous in the popular imagination that I do see people reading manga on trains without covers. But it's still a practice that I think is respected, and it's something that's still done by bookstores even to this day. Another indicator for the older consumer was price. These books were sold at 4 times the price of magazines, and this price was obviously not conducive to children. And this is something that also persists to this day. These books are smaller than magazines with fewer pages. The page quality is higher, but the price is typically 2 to 3 times as much as what a magazine would cost. So this is another aspect that continues to the present day. And finally, we have obviously the content. As you can see on the book covers here, these books were geared towards a older, young adult crowd. They had, salarymen, escapades. They were bawdy entertainments. They also had political and realistic gekiga, which were more kind of mature art form that had very violent stories. And so these were different ways that these early books were trying to target a more sophisticated, older crowd. But even when this crowd was targeted, or even when children's content was made into these books, they were rebranded in this transition. And Yamamori has described this, I think, perfectly using Umezu Kazuo's manga. Umezu's work, Benigumo, which you can see here on the very left, or Crimson Spider, was serialized in 1965 in the shoujo or girls manga magazine Shoujo Friend. And it was released in an anthology collection with this cover art that distinguished it as a product for young girls, right? You could see the kind of characteristic big eyes of shoujo manga. But when it was republished as a comics by Asahi Sonorama's Sun Comics label on the right-hand side, the cover was changed to this, as you see here, a much more, violent, or at least horror-themed, maybe not violent, but horror-themed, scary cover that was targeting, again, an adult audience. So the content itself didn't change. It's just that the cover changed to acknowledge a different consumer. So to summarize again, the distinction factor here, right? These books were trying to create distinction within their format. Now you might ask, this is the first instance we're seeing comics on a book, Sun Comics. And you might ask, why did they use comics, this word, English word comics, to describe this? Why not use manga? And I think the short answer for that is, again, distinction, or at least market distinction. Publishers at the time wanted to distinguish this product from other products existing at the time. And this was a distinction that was used in the beginning for seinen, or young adult manga. And Takita Seiichiro, in his History of Big Comic Magazine, has a monthly for male readers, gives 3 reasons that relate to market distinction for these young adult works. And he says, 1, to distinguish them from children's and boys manga. 2nd, to make clear that they were periodicals targeted towards college students or young salarymen. So again, not just children's manga, but for a specific male adult, young male adult, college student, early salaryman, young worker demographic. And then finally, to distinguish them from other manga that were emerging at the time. You have shonen manga, you have shoujo manga, but then you also have these other subgenres that are specified based on not necessarily the demographic, but the content. So you had like story manga, and story manga was distinct from, 4-panel manga, or comic or gag manga. I shouldn't say comic, gag manga. Or gekiga, as I talked about earlier, a highly political and realistic form of manga. So to not call it manga, these labels wanted to distinguish it, again, market distinction, trying to make it a more distinguished product. And comics were the word used for that. Now, I should add here, with comics, the rental market didn't just disappear overnight. In fact, many publishers embraced comics early on, and publishers of hardcover rental books became publishers of these cheaper paperbacks. And they even rented these books out because they could, they were more sturdy. They were sturdier than magazines, or they sold them outright. But eventually, older consumers began buying these books from bookstores and not renting manga. And so comics also reflect the growth of the Japanese economy, of the Japanese miracle, as readers no longer needed to rent and could now buy their own personal books. So continuing on, outside from distinction, another key historical facet of comics was their role in management and segmentation of manga. Many of these early Shinshoban comics did not organize serialized works, and they featured a greatest hits type of assortment of chapters. Publishers freely chose from popular works in the rental, akahon, and magazine sectors, and there was little regard to seriality. And we can see this in the great variation in page counts and manga book sizes. Comics today, if you read a comic, it rarely will exceed 200 pages because they've been standardized due to their alignment with the magazine. But some pages back then were, over 300 pages, and some were much shorter. And even comics from the same series varied in page counts. So it suggests that there was no alignment with the magazine and the serial content coming from the magazine and the comics, the book. The comics were merely an afterthought. They were simply an afterthought. The priority was on the magazine and the serialization of lots of content, getting lots of content in and out. And there was little regard to the actual drafts once the serialization was finished, which is the unthinkable today, as you see museums, putting up the original drafts and people, going up and ogling them and basking in the aura of the original manga author. At the time, many of these prints were just kind of tossed because again, the idea was that once you serialized it, once it appeared in a magazine, then its purpose was fulfilled and we needed new content. Um, some magazines, funnily enough, even gave out original pages as prizes to readers, meaning that a clean reprint of the original manga draft was impossible. And some publishers had to scan the magazine for a reprint, and it looked like crap. So because of these facts, it's more instructive to look at comics not as reprints, but as books. They were entirely different media. They were disconnected from the magazine. The publishing industry did not view them as connected products, but as products that would sell on their own, as books. This changed in 1967 as television animation became increasingly popular in Japan. The publisher Kodansha created the Kodansha Comics line to allow readers to re-experience or tsuitaiken the manga, their favorite works that had been adapted to anime series. KC was serial from its inception, and it encouraged readers to consume and possess long-running works rather than disposing of them immediately after reading them, like magazines. However, by aligning the periodical with the content of the magazine, and the proprietary magazine, I should say, Weekly Shonen magazine, in this case from Kodansha, comics then didn't just become a reprint. As Kodansha describes it through their own self-published history, Kodansha comics were books whose form of distribution would manage the magazine. So KC, with KC, the imperatives of the comic book aligned with the magazine. And this is what Yamamori calls magazine media, where the book's label becomes linked with reprinting the work of a particular magazine. Remember, books could freely choose from the market, from all sorts of different works to print and collect, right, in a kind of digest form. But that freedom ends with the Kodansha Comics line, as Kodansha Comics becomes strictly aligned with reprinting and managing the content of the magazine. At this point, manga's serialization isn't about selling magazines anymore, at least strictly magazines. The expectation is that the serialized manga in the magazine is going to be reprinted and then resold via comics book. So while magazines still have a lot of emphasis in the issues they sell are going to lead to these comics. Now, this comics decision by Kodansha, this comics line, would lead to a rush of other publishers putting out their own comics line into the 1970s. New magazines launched with both magazine and comics labels at the same time, like Shonen Jump and Shonen Champion. And it was at this point that, again, comics no longer were a book publication independent from the magazine. They were now a form of media inextricably tied to the magazine, particularly shonen and shoujo children's manga magazines that were weekly. And these magazines had emerged and become quite popular in the 1960s. And again, there was a standardization here that aligned with weekly magazines and semi-regular comics releases of those chapters. This would also lead to the emergence of alternative genres. So we would also see alternative genres like seinen or young adult manga, creating genres not just through content, but through formats. So I actually have a couple examples here to show you. This is a typical, you can see here, typical Shinshoban size for I guess it's kind of hard to see here. There you go. A typical Shinshoban size of a tankobon, which is a paperback of a comics. And this is the standard Shinshoban size you can see here. Compared to that, we have a seinen. Oh, it's hard to see here. A seinen manga. You can see here the seinen manga is a little wider, right? It's using a different paper size, which is a B6 paper size. And this paper size was used again, the format was chosen for the particular audience. B6 books are bigger and they felt more luxurious, and thus they're more expensive. They could charge more, older consumer. The large size was also deemed better for manga criticism and appreciation. And so the format would help create the genre. So it wasn't just content emerging that became seinen. It was formats that were established that catered towards specific buying groups and demographics. And so we have seinen with their larger book sizes. And then we also have other, book sizes and book formats that come after that, like bunkobon. Bunkobon are associated with kind of like library books, at least bunko, right? Library storage. And these become kind of prestige labels that are tied to much older or manga with educational value. Or kanzenban. Kanzenban are, perfect versions or complete versions, and these are versions for popular works that are different from bunkobon. Bunkobon are, they have this historical educational value, and kanzenban are still a commercial product, but they are considered more of an art at that stage, and so they have additional high quality art that adorns their covers. So you can see some of the examples here. The top ones on the top level are seinen manga with, again, more mature subject matter, but also bigger books sizes. The bottom left, we have the bunkobons, which are smaller. Again, you can kind of fit them in a purse, you can fit them in a bag and take it out. And on the right-hand side, we see the kanzenban, which are even bigger typically than the seinen books, again, to cater towards reader criticism and appreciation, and also to collectors. And collecting for in and of itself becomes something of a reward and distinction for these books. Another key factor here, key affordance here, is the role of a storage and preservation for comics. Comics are a media that are conducive to story manga. Story manga meaning serial continuing storylines. Where magazines serialize narratives across issues, they also lend themselves to episodic storytelling, as complex stories are difficult to follow. Even though many different manga magazines have serial narratives today, in large part that's because of comics and the role they play in managing and storing those titles. Readers, of course, could collect magazine issues and refer back to them, but it's quite cumbersome to do this. And given the smallness of dwellings, most dwellings in Japan, especially for single people, it's highly incompatible with everyday life. The magazines, again, are huge. So magazines, disposable product, right? Comics, again, preservable product, collectible product. And they give a second life to titles that had more complex serial narratives. So one, I think, popular example that's often cited is Cyborg 009 by Ishinomori Shotaro. This is a work that had a serialization in one manga magazine and ended fairly early. And it had a small niche following, but it didn't have nearly as many fans until the work was collected in a comics where fans could follow and reread the complex sci-fi plot. And Cyborg 009 would be serialized over several years, over many magazines, over 16 years. And it found and continued to have this audience that would follow it because of the comics that would collect these chapters, no matter where it was being serialized. So discontinued titles like Cyborg 009 were kind of rediscovered through comics readerships, and allowed for, again, complex plots and serial narratives rather than episodic serial storytelling. They were also transmedial in that they coupled with the TV anime adaptation, and it allowed readers to smoothly follow the complex plot of both series, despite the weekly temporal interruptions of a television broadcast. So the TV anime and comics helped facilitate the seriality of one another. And if you want to draw a more contemporary parallel to this, we can look at comics as a kind of form of manga storage and rereading that was quite similar, or allowed story manga narratives to flourish in a manner akin to how DVD box sets or over-the-top television has created a golden age of long-form television today, as audiences are now more easily able to catch up or rewatch serial television narratives. So, this is part of manga development, and that's why there's such a long history already of manga serial narrative. Conversely, comics also become political or politicized, and they become a tool that reflects politics and culture, as some manga are purposely not made into comics. As Yamamori also puts it, these were anti-magazine media. This was due to the fact that they did not become comics after magazine serialization. And these are a couple titles here that were not made into comics immediately after their serialization. Barefoot Gen, which is about, it's a wartime story about survivors, victims of the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima, and Ashura, which is a story about real destitute, feudal survivors, cannibalism. These works were highly critical of the Japanese military and Japanese imperialism. They referenced wartime conditions, and so they were quite controversial. And some of these works led their magazines to be classified as harmful content, flagged, and even banned at some public and school libraries. So comics became a sign of distinction, but also a sign of kind of political and cultural stability. Works that didn't become comics were works of social disruption. According to Yoshiaki, shonen manga magazines and paperbacks were a media that discriminately chose which texts were publishable. And this is because, unlike disposable magazines, comics were a media of ownership, and problematic works last, right? They become part of the record in this format. Thus, comics became a method of storage for certain works, certain serialized works that were granted institutional approval. And other works that were not had to be preserved by alternate publishers who had to preserve these works from being lost. Now, into the 1970s and 1980s, we see manga try to much more think past its current manga authorship. And so manga paperbacks also start displaying the authors in much more prominent ways. One way they do this is through the dust jacket inner flaps. You can see here these two pictures here. These are little avatars that are created by the manga author that stand in for themselves. Some manga authors use actual photos, but it's not so common today to do that. Most use some kind of little avatar to stand in for themselves. And then they'll have a comment here. This is from Chainsaw Man. He says, "I like chainsaws." Not much of a comment. It's other authors are much more engaging with their comments, but even this is a way to kind of read this person's personality. But these comments in the paperbacks reflect the comments that we see also in the manga magazine. The manga magazines also have comments, as you can see here on the right-hand side, that are displayed from the authors in the table of contents in every issue. And this is important for the manga publisher because manga magazines rely on recruiting and training readers to become manga authors themselves. Scholars such as Jennifer Pro have shown how shoujo manga magazines, girls manga magazines, editors and authors work together at fabricating community in order to create an environment for readers to become creators. Shonen manga does something similar with this. They use more masculine language like training. But both types of magazines grow readers into becoming creators for the magazine. They do this through contests. They invite readers to submit their own works like competitions, and then editors will work with them. But even before that, there's this engagement process through the magazine where the manga authors will speak to the readers through their comments. They'll evaluate reader submissions through, you can see right here, the manga authors are giving their comments, they're giving their feedback for particular works that were awarded prizes. So the magazine facilitates a kind of, or the authors and editors facilitate a process within the magazine that tries to educate and evaluate readers in this kind of, fabricated dialogue. And this dialogue between authors and readers continues in the comics. There are Q&As, for example, that act as behind the scenes where readers will write in comments or write in questions to the manga authors, and then they'll answer them in detail here. Sometimes readers will write in or provide illustrations, and these can be featured as well. So it, again, creates this kind of connection, disparate despite the disparate global conditions or geographic conditions, the readers are connected in some way through the platform of the magazine and the comics. And the comics could also act as a recruitment device where the authors would solicit ideas from readers to use in stories. And this was the case, for example, in Kinnikuman, as we can see on the right-hand side here, where enemy and monster ideas were solicited from readers and incorporated into the serialized manga. So you can see the names of Nakahiro-kun here from Osaka, or Shibata-kun here from Aomori. They had contributed these characters, and that dialogue then becomes part of the creative process, signaling to readers that their tastes and talents are valued by the creators and publishers. So these are kinds of correspondences between author and reader, as Gerard Jeanette has put it, and they work simply not. They don't work simply to educate the reader about the production process, but they also work to actively cement the legacy and authority and privilege of this particular publisher's brand. Finally, I have here a section on added value. And this is where comics today are increasingly adding new aspects to the original manga that are serialized in the magazine. Like Blu-ray box sets of popular television series, comics are increasingly including extras that are only available to collectors, whether they're covers like dust jackets with more evocative illustrations, and you'll see in the monochromatic magazines. Magazines typically have very little color in them. To, as you can see on the bottom here with Dragon Ball, the spines themselves have portions of illustrations that if you collect them all and connect them, then you form the kind of elaborate imakimono type tapestry of all of the different characters here through the book spines. Although this is really uncommon today because it does require some coordination, and it requires attention to continuity that as many readers of Dragon Ball have pointed out, the author Toriyama Akira did not do, because he actually illustrated this one character, Yajirobe, like a super minor character. He illustrated him twice, like a beloved character because of this. But it's another thing, again, that can add value to the collection process. And increasingly, we see here these bands on the bottom third of the comics themselves. These are used to advertise for the magazine, for the comics, and they will maybe bring readers' attentions to changes over time that reflect public recognition in the comics. Say television adaptations, like we can see here. There's a TV anime that's going to be made to showcase the work's popularity, or like how many volumes the work has sold to, again, show how popular it is. So as a work becomes more popular, these bands can advertise previous works from the same author, casting distinction through association. Now, I'd like to focus more on the added value within the manga pages here, within the comics pages, on the book's various paratextual affordances, mostly created by the mangaka themselves. And collectively, this paratextual content in the paperback is referred to as omake, or exclusive extras, supplements. Omake is a term whose meaning changes based on the media in question. For TV shows, for example, omake can be bloopers or outtakes to the main program. In video games, they can refer to soundtracks or like plastic figures. And that's where a lot of the omake analysis in English has focused on, like Mark Steinberg and Otsuka Eiji have focused on Astro Boy stickers or Bikkuriman stickers, and they're packaged with like chocolates. And so the chocolates become delivery devices for the real product, which become Atomu merchandise, Bikkuriman merchandise, or Bikkuriman stories. Ordinary objects become collectible commodities through this. And this is quite common with a lot of omake analysis. Histories of omake deal with this. But there is also a practice with manga and manga magazines to include their own omake. And shoujo manga, girls manga magazines are much more, they have done this much longer, I think, than most other types of magazines. They have a process called furoku, or supplements that they include with magazines. And these are constructed typically of paper and were attached to magazines that were often also, again, created by the mangaka. And these furoku, as you can see here, they were like letter sets, files, cards, little bags, paper constructions that were a bonus for purchasing the manga magazine. And shonen or boys manga, which is what Kimetsu no Yaiba is, have not really done this as much. The sales of the magazines were so strong that they kind of slowly stopped including supplements. But the comics themselves actually have omake, except they are not material goods, but they are little sketch illustrations, trivia, or commentary, only available inside the comics. So these aren't something material that you can possess, but by purchasing the comics, you can have access to these omake contents. And my contention is, I think that I believe that Kimetsu's content has a furoku or gifting, a supplementary type of affordance within the comics because they reveal properties of storytelling and world building within paratextual contours that I think are quite atypical for most manga and show how comics are playing an increasingly creative role in the expansion of manga content. So these are a few different affordances of the comics omake that I've noticed here. And some of them overlap and some of them, they're not mutually exclusive, but there are certain patterns to them. And one, I think, useful way of looking at them is through what Gerard Genette, who's written about paratexts extensively in literary theory, he has termed a specific type of paratext called postfaces. And postfaces are notes from the author that expatiate on his subject, knowing that both sides are fully informed. So this is something that, familiar readers will be welcoming. And so this is something that acknowledges a familiar reader or a fan. The postface's location in the book and discursive function also comes after the core text of the main text. And so they can only hope to fulfill a curative or corrective function, in his words, due to their placement in the book following the material. And this is what I think is also happening in the Kimetsu omake paratext. They occur in the manga following concluded chapters, and they're very deliberate in their placement. And so these paratextual sketches provide visual annotation to the original text, clarifying or correcting elements of the associated material through various illustrative and textual means. So again, I've organized a few different categories here, a few different affordances here. Some of them overlap, but I tried to separate it into what I think their core affordances. And so this is the first one here. These are, appear in between the text. Maybe I can actually pull an example out here to show you what I mean. So if you see here, you can see the manga here. This is a little bit tough to see. There you go. That's where the manga chapter ends. And then the following chapter has a blank space, and that blank space is filled with these interstices are filled with these little sketches. And it's not uncommon for manga authors to include some kind of sketch here, but particularly for Kimetsu no Yaiba Demon Slayer, it's every single blank page has some kind of sketch, which I'll try to outline here in terms of their core affordances here. So the first one are self-representation or corrective sketches. And these are sketches that are quite simple, actually. They are correcting some error in the original manga. They might include character illustrations, but their purpose is to communicate the wishes and thoughts of the mangaka and to apologize or repair some aspect of the magazine serialization that wasn't noticed. And so it's fixed in the comics version. This is quite common, and so I won't dwell on this one too much. But these long apologies are quite funny and rare. These are more common to lots of different mangaka, reflective sketches. Although again, I think Kimetsu Demon Slayer is unique in the fact that the sketches are reflecting on the concluded chapters, or they're reflecting key themes of the chapters. They're not just done to look cool. They're actually done to reflect specific moments or themes here. I don't have the time, unfortunately, to do a real close analysis of this particular example, but this is the cover that lies underneath the dust jacket. I can show you actually what I mean here. So we have the dust jacket here. Then we have the cover. This is something I think that's maybe exclusive to Japan, because I think most foreign versions, most English language versions of this just use the dust jacket as a cover, and they don't have a dust jacket attached. So this interior illustration is something that's kind of a pleasure for readers of print paperback versions in Japan. And but this particular cover here is actually reflecting one of the key themes of this work, where this is the mother of this character on the dust jacket, and this mother is actually deceased and exists within the character. So it's kind of reflecting the position of this character within this mother character within the actual son here, and it reflects other themes as well related to excavation of memories and excavation of dream states. And so it's also something that readers must excavate for themselves, right? By opening the book and trying to connect these illustrations to the themes of the text. And there are other examples within the interstices as well that are reflecting on themes within the manga in oblique ways. So they're not necessarily spelled out directly, and the readers have to make those connections for themselves. Another version here are parodies or palliative sketches. And these can also reflect or comment upon the manga, but they're more done to deflect tension from the narrative. There are alternative designs or rejected designs, outtakes, gags that frequently offer a lighter comical reality that's been removed from the manga's quite grim world. Part of this lightness and touch comes from the quality of the designs themselves. They're rendered in pencils typically, rather than the G pen, which is the device that's used for the kind of bold lines and strokes of shonen manga. So the use of pencil here is practical. It's easy to do a lot of sketches, but it's also stylistic, because these pencil sketches also mimic moments of heavy deformity in the manga used for comical situations. So these sketches provide a kind of liminal quality to manga chapters that can otherwise be difficult to replicate outside of the magazine. It breaks up chapters, in other words, to comment on and de-escalate the preceding action. A fourth function or affordance here are these narrative paratexts that become much more common as the manga develops. And Taisho Koso Koso Wasabanashi, the Taisho secrets, or the Warring States secrets, or the spillover stories. You can see here they become quite dense. They become typed out because there's so much text that needs to be fit on the page. And these are narratives that are stretched often across multiple interstices, to the point that there's a text-based serial narrative running alongside the main text within the comics, commenting on and contextualizing it. And most of these tales act as a kind of coda or epilogue to the concluded chapter. And they provide when I say a curative affordance, because they resolve unresolved plot lines or tensions, and they reveal aspects of characters that were not elucidated within the manga itself. One of the examples here on the bottom left here, Sayo's story. It's a very short coda to this particular manga chapter, which had a child survivor of a brutal massacre, and her perspective is not revealed in the manga itself. So this is something, again, that these tales, these narratives are drawing upon and elaborating upon. Finally, we have this omake of alternate worlds, which I label restorative, because they restore characters to states that either they never had, or to kind of optimistic life states. In this manga, many characters meet very grim fates, and they get killed off, frankly. And these paratexts here bring back these characters in kind of alternative forms. You could view it as a kind of parody, but because they're continuing, there's so many versions of this, it builds this alternate universe, this alternate world that I think is a little bit more complex than a simple parody. It's more similar to what are akin to like fan fiction or doujinshi, which are fan-produced derivative works that are based on existing manga and anime works. It's weird to have the manga author create their own fan fiction alongside the manga work, because fan fiction is typically reflecting a different type of desire that is not represented in the original work. So you can read these alternative works as the manga author's desires for a work or world that he or she cannot represent within the actual manga itself, which I find interesting as a kind of way to both extend and recuperate the manga author's agency. But this idea of restoration is not just a metaphorical one. The final volume also adds omake pages of missing manga, not included in the manga magazine. So I talked about corrective ones, right? Corrective manga omake, or, might just fix an illustration, but in Kimetsu no Yaiba, there were entire pages that were added to the final manga, which again is pretty rare to do. And these final pages elaborate on some of the ideas depicted in the alternative worlds, this kind of peaceful contemporary setting. So essentially, within the comics, the paratexts that have been developed over these many, many chapters and books merge with the main text to create a bit of a strange ending if you haven't read the comics, this kind of utopic alternative to the character's violent circumstances and environment. So that's essentially where I'm stopping. And this talk is going to conclude here, I think, with the most recent affordances that I've noticed with Kimetsu no Yaiba, and comics themselves, right? From beginning with their role in managing, segmenting, preserving, authoring, and even reorienting serialized manga. And I didn't have time to talk about this here, but comics are also now a fundamental paratext that manage a broader system of intertextuality, in the words of Jonathan Gray. There is a whole host of original material that is now not derived from the manga proper, but from the paratexts of the comics. And these paratexts are then remediated and reincorporated into the other formats like the television anime broadcast. What's interesting is these paratexts are also paratextual in these broadcasts, so they'll be like the anime eye catches, which precede commercial breaks, or they'll be in the next episode previews, like you can see here, that are also kind of metatextual, that the characters are standing on top of their magazine cutouts, manga cutouts, and commenting on them. Or the Kimetsu Gakuen itself becomes a net animation. And so taking this talk full circle, right? We started with Kimetsu, ending with Kimetsu. I believe it's very instructive, highly instructive, to view Demon Slayer, this media phenomenon, through its comics, because the comics mediate and manage publisher, fan, and transmedial expressions and desires. They also speak the language of commodification. Due to the sheer overproduction and overload of paratextual narrative in Kimetsu's comics, it's tempting to read each of the Kimetsu texts, the manga, TV series, film, there's musicals, net animation, as liminal paratexts that shuttle consumers from one media text to another. And while the Kimetsu manga has concluded, the ethos of the Kimetsu franchise, on the other hand, can be considered one of constant omake and liminality, each tying into and expanding upon one another in a long chain of extended mediality. Beyond simply adapting chapters of the manga that bridge the two story arcs, then, the Infinite Train movie has become a liminal vehicle that is transporting us along what is likely to be an infinite track of Kimetsu content consumption ahead. Thank you for your time and attention.
Hello, Brian. It's Raina.
Raina.
Hi.
Hi, you're in.
I'm here. Hello. And thank you so much. That was an amazing talk. Absolutely wonderful. I'm just trying to see if I will be allowed to turn on my camera at some point. But for now, I just want to, I'm sure, join everybody. Some of my PhD students have been chatting with me on in a different format and just saying how lovely it was to hear this talk and how clear and wonderfully precise it's been. So thank you so much.
Thank you again for inviting me. It's been it was fun researching it.
Oh my goodness, I have so many questions, but I'm aware we do have some questions in the chat. We have one from one of my colleagues, Ra Mason, who is asking if it would be fair to say that Kimetsu no Yaiba's success is also partly due to changes in consumption patterns that result from coronavirus and the pandemic recently. So that was his first question, but he had a second one as well. I think the second question was asking how there's a kind of pattern of repetition within the plot lines and the arcs as the series goes on, and he was asking, do you think this focus on depth or detail over storytelling is reflective of contemporary manga culture and writing, or something else? So two very different questions for you to start with.
Yeah, I would be interested in hearing their response as well to that. But I guess definitely Kimetsu no Yaiba's success in all media formats, film and manga and anime, were heavily indebted to the coronavirus pandemic. There's been a lot of discourse spilled on how over-the-top television, right? Netflix, and not just Netflix, but Kimetsu is available on pretty much any media platform. The anime was available on any media platform you can find, whether it was Netflix, Amazon Prime, Unext, you name it. It was available on almost any platform you can find. And so people stuck at home were, watching this. And so that was obviously a big factor in the success of the film, which smartly enough, and I don't think, obviously the creators did not anticipate that, but the film picks off from the conclusion of the anime series, which is a bit of a strange decision. We were talking about that before.
Right? Yeah,
it's unusual. Yeah, it's not unheard of, but for large kind of popular franchises such as this one, it might be more common with niche titles with smaller audiences where it's not expected that they're not expecting more casual readers or fans to go to a movie theater. In this case, it's a bit of an unusual choice to do that. And so that was, I think, another maybe factor to do with the success of it. But definitely the coronavirus pandemic encouraged a lot more digital consumption and encouraged, obviously, which hurt magazines. This hurts magazines a lot, is fewer trips to convenience stores.
Yeah.
So yeah, less commuting to work, right? Means people are going to convenience stores, and that's still the biggest place where people purchase manga magazines, not from bookstores, but from convenience stores. Whereas bookstores and online shipping is where more people have acquired print paperbacks, and so those areas suffered less during the pandemic. People can get books shipped to them, and then they can also, of course, download them to their devices, their reading tablets.
I mean, it's interesting. A lot of the questions are around those ideas of how things are moving into maybe new digital formats. So Ben Pinsent says, and by the way, everyone's saying thank you so much for this talk. It's so fantastic. Ben Pinsent had a question about how the increase in digital readers and apps might be affecting the way these paperbacks are being sold. And I think there's maybe two sides to that question. Maybe one about, have you seen kind of sales dropping off in one format but rising in another? But maybe the other side of that question would be about the kinds of omake you're talking about and how they are changed as a result of new platforms for publishing.
Um, so I think that's a great question. If I can just maybe quickly answer the previous question, I think there was a
Yeah,
question about like
there was,
storytelling.
there was,
I
sorry, my bad.
That's okay. I just I would say probably it's not any more repetitive or redundant than most shonen manga, which have
Mhm.
a formula that tends to be repeated. And probably Kimetsu is a little less repetitive than some of them because it ended fairly early. A lot of
Yeah.
these really popular titles will continue for like, 3 or 4 more cores or arcs.
Mhm.
And Kimetsu thankfully just ended with the end of its main arc. So, but I think the repetitiveness is more generic than it is particular to Kimetsu no Yaiba, Demon Slayer. Um, for the question that was just asked, it's interesting how the industry is trying to respond to digital consumption. And Shonen Jump is a company I think that's trying to do some Shueisha as a company and Shonen Jump as a publication are trying to do things I think that are maybe more reactive and a little bit more pro-reactive than other companies. So they have moved very aggressively into digital comics production,
Yeah.
where before Shonen Jump, was the main magazine and they had brother magazines, and now they have a platform specifically for online manga creation. And sometimes, for example, Chainsaw Man starts in Shonen Jump and then will move to the digital platform. And so they're not necessarily like inferior platforms. They have some very popular titles, and they can be a little bit more. Hi, they can be a
Hi.
little bit more. Let's say progressive in terms of the content that they have. Um, I had another thought related to that. But what's interesting is that these digital comics that are produced, digital manga, I should say, that's produced, um, have the same look as analog or print manga.
Yeah.
And that is distinct from, like, say, Korean or Chinese webcomics, which are meant to be read on a phone. And so I'm not sure how that transition is going to continue. I feel that the manga industry wants to preserve this format of reading from right to left, right? They want to preserve the analog format, and digital is merely kind of remediating or it's transferring those analog formats to digital platforms, but not really engaging with the digital platforms in the way maybe like web comics or Chinese comics are, web comics are.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. The example Ben mentioned is actually probably the main app for manga in translation, Viz,
Uh-huh.
which is, taking a lot of those Shonen Jump properties and, translating them and then republishing them in America and the UK. And it's interesting to think about how they're trying so hard to reproduce those comics kind of looking formats, despite the fact that they're making them for screens of variable sizes and shapes. And
And I think that's probably to their strength. They realize, and I don't think that's going to drastically change because um, I've watched a ton of Shonen Jump kind of reflexive works. They do a lot of works that kind of talk about their legacy. And I think there's this real strong desire to connect whatever is coming out now to this legacy, to this kind of ecosystem of creation. It's like franchise logics, right? You want to be part of a successful franchise. So drawing upon that, connecting future authors to that, I think is their kind of brand strategy. And so I think it's probably why we're going to continue to see, and it's to the strength of, I think, Japanese draftsmanship and tradition of manga. There's been just um, many different authors, not necessarily Japanese, but Japan publishing with manga that has kind of perfected this form. So yeah, I think it's to their strength to use those kind of developed techniques as opposed to trying to do something, compete on a field that Korea and China already have a big head start on.
yeah, Yeah, it's interesting to see how web comics in different parts of Asia are starting to re-influence manga in its own right, whereas manga kind of led the way initially. So
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, I think we're probably going to see a lot more of this kind of like circular inspiration.
and that kind of circular inspiration is interesting to think about in terms of one of the other questions we've had, which is about specifically things that were web only starting points. Bethany Meisner, I think it is, has asked, are the digital exclusive manga being counted in the overall success and number of sales like magazines within Japanese publishing, or are they treated separately in the way that maybe a tankobon is treated separately?
Digital exclusive manga counted in the overall success and number of sales like magazines.
Yeah, so do they get included in the main sales figures, or are they?
Oh yeah, definitely they get included. Yeah, so that's part of it. And so until recently, print paperbacks were the by far largest selling category of manga, and now I think it's changed. It's digital in the last year. It's flipped.
Maybe a COVID.
Yes, accelerated, right? That's
Yeah.
like everybody's saying it's the great accelerant, and I think that's what happened with digital manga, where digital manga sales have, I think, surpassed print paperback sales for the first time. So that's not going back in the bottle, and they're definitely counted. And digital magazine sales are counted as well, but I'm not sure how that's going to work, because if you can buy like an individual chapter every week, people might do something like that. I think Jump or maybe working with Viz, they have an agreement where you can subscribe, right? You pay like a subscription fee every month, and then you can just access what you want. And in that case, I wonder if the magazine format will survive, because it seems like readers can just kind of pick individual titles and not have to. The magazine supports all sorts of titles, right? So it's like it's designed in a way to like what film used to do with block booking, right? Like you would theaters would have to take the big blockbuster film, but then that would also support these small B films. And I feel like manga is also regulated, or it's operated on that kind of system where the big titles also support the smaller titles that maybe don't have an audience yet, or maybe the author doesn't have a hit with this work but will with the next work. And I'm wondering if that system can continue to survive if readers can just kind of pinpoint the sole title they want and not bother with the other stuff.
Yeah, I wonder if that will impact on the rise of new authors as well.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, not everybody gets a hit with their first series, right? Kotoge had several one-shots before she did this particular success story, and that's quite common, right? Like you try and then you get better and better, right? It's pretty rare to just have like your first title just be a smash success, and so. Yeah, I'm wondering too about that like process of training and practice and slow marginal improvement. But that system doesn't exist for webcomics, right? Like they just go right into it. And I'm not really familiar with reading like webcomics from China and Korea so much, so I can't speak to how well it's working. But it's definitely, there's a lot of stuff out there from it, and so it's quite popular. So they seem to be figuring it out as they go along.
Yeah. So we've got one more question, and I think we've got just enough time. So Thomas Walker has asked about, I guess it's a question really about the longevity of titles, that keeping titles alive through these kind of cyclical publishing regimes. So he asks, would individual stories be published in the different book styles, different sizes, for different types of appreciation, or is it is that happening kind of simultaneously, or is it more of a linear sort of process where it goes from one format to another to another?
It can change over time, and so certain titles like this is the standard for a lot of titles for especially for children's works.
I found my copy of Jump that was hiding.
Oh, excellent. I wish
You can see how big it is by comparison to.
I haven't left my house in like 6 days. So I like,
I don't know
was
why
like,
this is in my house.
so thank you for sharing that. Yeah. So it's so much bigger, right? And that's a conducive media that's conducive for, and it's cheaper to produce, but it's a media conducive for, really glorying in like these full page spreads. It's to highlight the author's work. And these ones again are more standard for the adaptation of those types of works. But I guess to answer your question, yes, different sizes typically are associated with different reading habits. Larger sizes are much more common. And I should say, it's like when I say larger sizes, it's like this. It's not even like the magazine size, but it's just a slightly larger size again to distinguish it from what other smaller magazine manga comics are. And it tends to be these larger sizes are for either more adult works or more, let's say, avant-garde or artistic works, less commercial works that are published maybe in magazines or maybe as like kind of specialized series, not necessarily like intended to be long-running series. They can also, again, be published as a kind of reprinting. And so I didn't have time to go into so much about all the different sizes, but like smaller sizes. So it's like my manga will go through like cycles where, it might start like this, and then it gets into a bigger size once it like gets a reprint for,
like classic status. Yeah.
A classic status. And then it gets into even a more classic status with like the really small bunkobun books, which are even cheaper. And there was a whole period where there was like a bunko boom, where it was like fashionable to like have this like old book that you would carry around with you and just like kind of read. And that's kind of each book format designates a type of distinction upon the manga work. So you don't see yet Dragon Ball Bunko Bones, but you probably will, and you might actually. I don't know. I don't know if Bunko Bones will still be produced for these titles with digital publishing so predominant now, but that's at least historically been these different functions for works to kind of designate them,
I wonder if they'll
popular,
be
classic, more classic, or legendary.
I was just wondering about that, whether digital publishing might have the effect of creating a new collector's market for manga. So having a more kind of upscale copy of the manga in hardcover is a real sign of distinction for fans. I'm not going to make it to try and tell the future, but I wonder, because we've seen that happen repeatedly in American comics publishing traditions.
Yeah, absolutely. And collections for American comics as well.
Yeah, it's actually starting to happen more and more for manga in America. We're getting these kind of lovely boxed versions of the translated manga now that come with hardcover kind of boxes. Yeah. I've got one over there for Utena and one down by my feet for Nausicaa.
Oh, Nausicaa. Well, yeah, both of those I have. I would love to have both of those sets. Interesting. Yeah. That looks like actually similar to the Japanese Nausicaa set, right? The bigger box for that. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. And so
there's so many formats though. I had like 1,000 questions and I wish I had time to ask you. I thought the points you were raising about the way fans are being rewarded for maybe buying these comics a second time were really interesting. All those things that the author is doing to try and apologize and maybe thank fans. I think those are really interesting asides and ways to bring the fans along to the new format. I wondered if you'd like to say anything more about those just to finish up today.
Particularly the authoring content, or
and the way the self-representation in amongst all of that is very interesting. I think the dynamic of being the author and creator versus kind of in collaboration and dialogue with the fans in this
Yeah.
particular case for Kimetsu no Yaiba is fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, this author is still quite mysterious, and we haven't seen, there's rumors that it's a female author, which also would be unique for a shonen manga of this popularity, although not out of place because we've seen, Full Metal Alchemist and other titles with female authors. But for Shonen Jump, it would be maybe a little bit unusual. In any case, though, this, the comics function for this, I think, is interesting because magazines do rely so heavily on building this kind of relationship. I think much more than other types of graphic art. There's this constant like recruitment process that's going on all year, and this is something you don't see just reading the comics. If you read the magazines, every other issue is filled with like, send in your proofs, send in your material. I mean, probably some of your students here have seen or read Bakuman, which
Yeah.
is a kind of, I
I
think it
read it.
actually, yeah, it really goes through the process, I think, really well. But that process is not like hidden. It's quite apparent in the magazine, and now, Shueisha is, putting out all these other media to try to show how that process has been facilitated by editors. And that's one thing I think that we maybe kind of take for granted, is that, it's mangaka are, of course, the authors of the manga, but there are a lot of other editors, assistants that are involved in this process that are kind of managing the whole thing and making it seem like it's like this seamless dialogue, when really it's a real production. I mean, it's still a much more maybe, localized and small production than other types of media, but it's still heavily managed and heavily, I think,
Oh, yeah.
regulated by the publisher. So it's to the great benefit of the publisher for readers to kind of think that that kind of dynamic is there. And I think, again, that's where Shueisha is trying to continue building. You can make tons of money making web comics for yourself and have no boss, or you can like be connected to this network of legendary mangaka who you will be invited to parties, and you can continue to meet. And that kind of mythology, I think, is where they are trying to emphasize.
Yeah, the network, I suppose, is key there, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's not like an animation network where you're like working with them. It's just like existing. And so it's like a mystique or a mythos that I think kind of gives something like this, which technically, I mean, they shouldn't really have a severe advantage over other companies, gives them a major advantage. And beyond that, of course, you have all the major licensing tie-ins that they have now. And so, it's not just, prestige, but also like, that's probably the fastest way to get your work into, other media like animation or film, getting it into Shonen Jump. That's probably the easiest ticket. So, that's the obvious one that it doesn't need to be spelled out, I think. Obvious reason.
Thank you so much, Brian. I literally could talk to you all day, but we are right out of time.
I probably went too late, so
much.
I'm sorry about that as well on my
Oh,
end.
no, it entirely due to technical faults on our side, I suspect. But thank you so much. Your talk was fabulous, and I've learned so much that I didn't know before. So on behalf of the whole audience here, thank you so very much. And I hope we can get you back soon to tell us more about the research you're doing, because it sounds wonderful.
Well, thank you. Thank you again. And thank you to everybody at the center. And yeah, hopefully, I mean, this is fun, but hopefully we can all be in the same room at some point in the next time we do this. And
oh, that would be amazing. Yes.
Continue the discussion.
Shehzad, is there anything else we need to add today?
Yes, a very brief announcement from me after I thank Brian, Professor Harzheim, for an absolutely fascinating talk. I don't know much about manga, but it was really interesting to listen and to kind of enlighten myself. And I'm sure that students, our students and other students in the audience found this quite interesting and useful. Hopefully will use this knowledge in their future research. Maybe some of them will use it in their essays. So thank you very much. It's fascinating. And I also hope that you will be able to come to Norwich at some point in the future when we're all allowed to travel, and we can continue this conversation.
I would love that. Thank you.
Thank you. So the brief announcement I have is about our next month's CJS webinar, which is going to be slightly different. It's going to be the last webinar in this semester. It's going to be a roundtable research webinar on the Anglo-Japanese relations in the 2 decades between 1894 to 1914, tentatively titled Mutual Fascination. And we have 2 speakers apart from the host, who will be myself. We have Dr. Chika Tonooka from Cambridge/Princeton, and we have Dr. Anthony Best from LSE. So it's going to be on the 13th of May, which is the 2nd Thursday of May. And there will be further announcements on the website Japan in Norwich, but also on social medias and email lists. So I hope to see many of you on that webinar too. Once again, thank you very much to our guest speaker today, and also thank you, Reina, for chairing the Q&A. Thank you everybody for your attention and your questions, and I hope to see you in our next events.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.